The stage is slowly fading into darkness. There is no more applause, no more theme song that once echoed through the youth of millions. Only a quiet question lingers in the air. How does a man who once embodied hope, youth, and the fragile dreams of first love leave this world at just 48 years old? There was a time when the name James Van Der Beek defined an entire generation. He was the boy by the river, Dawson Leery, the symbol of the late 1990s. When love was still awkward, ideals were still intact, and the world seemed to have all the time in the world to wait. But life beyond the screen was never as simple as a teenage script. Behind that familiar smile was a journey few people truly saw. A boy who once believed he didn't belong under the spotlight. An actor trapped inside the very image that made him famous. A man who stepped away from Hollywood in search of peace, only to suddenly enter a battle no one thought would come. Cancer. Not in old age, not after a reckless life, but while he was still training, still healthy, still a father of 6 who believed tomorrow would always stretch far ahead. In the final months of his life, James said the illness had taught him how to truly live, that it forced him to see what mattered most. Not fame, not roles, but ordinary moments with his family. And then, on a February morning in 2026, that story came to a close. But the death of James Van Der Beek was not merely the passing of a television star. It was a warning, a story about time, the one thing we always believe we have plenty of, until we don't. In today's video, we will retrace that entire journey, from a shy boy in Connecticut to a pop culture icon, to a quiet battle that most of the world only learned about when it was already too late. And when the final spotlight fades, the question that remains is not how James Van Der Beek died, but this: did we ever truly understand who he was? Before he became a familiar face to an entire generation of American television, James Van Der Beek was simply a boy growing up in a kind of normalcy so ordinary it was almost invisible. He was born in 1977 in Connecticut, a quiet small town where life moved at an unhurried pace, shaped by school football fields, familiar streets, and simple dreams. No one then could have imagined that this boy would one day become a pop culture symbol. And perhaps James himself never imagined it either. Far from the confident image audiences would later see on screen, he was a shy, introverted child who often felt slightly out of step with the crowd. He once described himself as a bit of a strange kid, someone who observed more than he spoke, who thought more than he showed. In his earliest school years, James faced a challenge few people knew about: dyslexia. While classmates read fluently and moved ahead with ease, he had to learn more slowly, try harder, and wrestle with the quiet feeling of not quite keeping up. But if there was one trait that shaped James from an early age, it was this: he refused to let a challenge become a boundary. He studied harder, worked longer, and gradually proved that early struggles do not determine a person's future. At that time, his greatest dream had nothing to do with a stage or a camera. He loved sports. Football was not just a game. It was the place where he felt he belonged. On the field, the shyness disappeared. There was only speed, the pounding rhythm of his heart, and the comfort of being part of a team. But life often changes direction in the smallest of moments. At 13, a serious injury forced him off the field for a long stretch of time. For a boy who lived and breathed sports, it was not only physical pain. It was the feeling of losing a future before it had even begun. The dream of becoming an athlete closed quietly. And in that emptiness, another door opened. James found his way to the stage almost by accident, a temporary refuge to fill the time. But the very first moment he stood beneath the lights, something shifted. There, he did not have to be the shy boy from everyday life. He did not have to explain himself. He did not have to struggle to fit in. The stage allowed him to become anyone. And from that point on, for the first time in his life, James Van Der Beek began to feel that perhaps he had finally found where he truly belonged. There are moments in life that seem small when they happen, yet later become the turning points that change everything. For James Van Der Beek, that moment came when he was just 15 years old, a boy from a quiet Connecticut town who knew nothing about Hollywood, found the courage to tell his mother he needed to go to New York, not to travel, not to see Broadway, but to find an agent, to begin a path he himself did not yet know where it would lead. It was not reckless confidence. It was a quiet conviction that the stage had called his name. And New York opened the first door. James quickly began appearing in off-Broadway productions at a very young age. The stage lights no longer frightened him. On the contrary, they became the only place where he felt truly seen. In everyday life, he remained the quiet young man, slightly out of place in a crowd. But on stage, he could live many different lives, free from the shyness that had followed him since childhood. Later, James entered college on an English scholarship, a choice that seemed more stable, more secure. But with each passing day, he realized he was standing between two worlds. On one side, the familiar academic path, and on the other, the persistent pull to pursue acting professionally. Then the opportunity arrived. In 1997, at around 20 years old, he auditioned for several television projects. One of them carried a rather ordinary-sounding title, Dawson's Creek. The irony was, James had nearly passed on it. In the character description, Dawson Leery was only 15. James was 20. And he looked at the breakdown and thought simply, "I'm too old for this." He set the script at the bottom of his audition pile, convinced the opportunity wasn't meant for him. But something pulled him back. During the audition, producers told him his voice sounded too mature, so James had to raise his tone, make it younger, and when they discovered his real age, something unexpected happened. Instead of rejecting him, they saw something special. The creator of the show, Kevin Williamson, is said to have remarked, "I created this character, and that's him." A small decision in that audition room that day changed the entire course of James Van Der Beek's life. From a young man still caught between dream and reality, he was about to step into something no one can truly prepare for: global fame. And from that moment on, his life would never again be as simple as it once was. When 1998, a seemingly modest teen drama premiered on American television, Dawson's Creek. At the time, no one could have predicted it would become a cultural phenomenon, shaping the emotions of an entire generation of viewers. And at the center of that wave stood James Van Der Beek. As Dawson Leery, the dreamy, sensitive boy who believed wholeheartedly in ideal love, James quickly became a familiar face on screens everywhere. Within weeks of the show's debut, he was no longer an unknown young actor. He became a global teen icon, the face of the late 1990s, the character in whom millions of young viewers saw themselves. The series ran for 6 seasons, turning its cast into stars and thrusting James into a blinding spotlight few young people are ever truly prepared to face. But the spotlight always has a shadow. While audiences saw an idealized Dawson on screen, James had to live inside the mold that character created. He later admitted that he spent more time on set than at home. Filming days stretched to 14 hours, relentless, repetitive, exhausting. His personal life and the character began to blur together until the line between them was difficult to see. Fame arrived too quickly. One day, you are a college student uncertain about your future. The next, you are a face recognized everywhere you go. And no matter how glamorous it appears, it carries an invisible cost. James began to realize that audiences did not see him. They saw Dawson. Producers were not searching for James. They were searching for another version of Dawson in every new role. The pressure of being typecast arrived sooner than he expected. And behind the glossy teen posters and the screams of devoted fans stood a young man trying to figure out who he really was, when the world had already decided who he should be. And it was then that a quiet paradox began to take shape. Fame gave him everything, but it also began to take a part of who he truly was. When a role becomes iconic, it can open the doors to a career, but it can also become a shadow you spend a lifetime trying to step out of. After the explosive success of Dawson's Creek, James Van Der Beek understood that if he remained forever tied to the image of the dreamy Dawson Leery, he would be permanently confined. And so he began a quiet battle, a battle to prove he was an actor, not just a teen idol. The first bold step came with Varsity Blues. James built muscle, transformed his appearance, and stepped into the role of a strong high school quarterback, a complete departure from the sensitive Dawson audiences once knew. The film was a major success, turning him into a new kind of late 90s Hollywood heartthrob. But even as his image shifted, the name Dawson always seemed to arrive one step ahead of him. So James pushed himself further, choosing darker, more complex roles. In the Rules of Attraction, he left behind the good guy persona and entered a world of rebellion, contradiction, and moral ambiguity. It was a deliberate choice, almost a declaration that he was not afraid to break audience expectations. Yet Hollywood does not easily forget a teen icon, and James found another way to confront that reality: self-parody. In later sitcoms, he willingly played fictionalized versions of James Van Der Beek, poking fun at the Dawson image the world had stamped onto him. He was unafraid to appear ridiculous, even to diminish his own past glamour, simply to prove that he was more flexible than people assumed. It was not just humor. It was liberation. An actor willing to laugh at the very image that made him famous, because he understood that only by breaking it could he truly grow. And behind all those choices was a tension that never completely disappeared. Between the image audiences adored, and the artist trying to mature, trying to rediscover himself. James Van Der Beek walked between those two worlds, grateful for his past, yet constantly striving to move beyond it. What he could not have known then was that the greatest battle of his life still lay ahead. Behind the bright lights of Hollywood, James Van Der Beek longed for something profoundly simple: an ordinary life. After years of fame and relentless efforts to step out of Dawson's shadow, his focus gradually shifted elsewhere, toward family. James married Kimberly Brooke, the woman he would later call the greatest anchor of his life. Without spectacle, without display, they built a life grounded in connection and in the belief that true happiness does not live on red carpets or beneath flashing cameras. Their family grew to include 6 children, a home filled with laughter, chaos, and the ordinary moments James often said meant more to him than any role he had ever played. But even within that happiness, life continued to test them. That Kimberly endured multiple miscarriages, silent losses whose weight only those who experience them can fully understand. James rarely spoke at length about that pain, but whenever he did, his voice would slow, as though there were emotions that had never completely healed. Then another blow came. He lost his mother. It was a shock that forced James to look inward, to reflect on time, on words left unsaid, on moments that once seemed abundant but had slipped away too quickly. And then, the pandemic arrived. As the world slowed down, James made a profound decision. He left Hollywood. He moved with his family to a sprawling ranch in Texas, far from the frantic rhythm of the entertainment industry. There, his days were no longer measured by shooting schedules or new projects, but by his children's laughter, sunsets over open fields, and the quiet peace he had been searching for all along. Perhaps for the first time in his life, James no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. No more pressure to be an icon. No more running faster than expectations. And it was precisely when he stepped away from the spotlight that he began to see himself more clearly than ever before. A husband, a father, an ordinary man, learning how to slow down. But that peace, as beautiful as it was, would only last for a short while. Because life still held one chapter none of them could have prepared for. There are moments in life when time seems to stop. A single sentence, brief and clinical, yet powerful enough to divide existence into two parts: before and after. In 2023, just as everything appeared to be on the right track, James Van Der Beek stepped into a chapter he had never anticipated. Outwardly, he looked completely healthy. He exercised regularly, maintained strong physical condition, lived more cleanly than many people his age. There was no image of a man carrying a life-threatening illness inside him. And so it began with signs so subtle they were almost unnoticeable. Just slight changes in digestion, a small discomfort, the kind most people would dismiss or blame on diet, stress, or something entirely ordinary. And James thought the same, but something urged him to look deeper. A decision that seemed simple, scheduling a colonoscopy, became the moment that changed his life. He walked into the exam room feeling calm, even slightly proud that he was taking responsibility for his health. He believed he was fine. Then the doctor said, "It's cancer. Stage 3, colorectal cancer." The disease had already spread to nearby lymph nodes, though it had not yet metastasized to distant organs. That meant a long, grueling battle lay ahead. One no one can emotionally prepare for in a matter of seconds. James later shared that the moment felt like waking up inside a nightmare he could not escape. Everything once familiar suddenly felt distant. Future projects, family, plans, peaceful days on the Texas ranch, all of it abruptly fragile. The irony was, the illness appeared when he was in the best physical shape of his life. And that paradox made James's story far more unsettling, because it shattered a belief many people quietly hold, that healthy means safe. From that point on, his life was no longer measured in years or long-term plans. It was measured in treatments, in medical appointments, in each day spent trying to keep life feeling normal for his family. A storm had begun, and for the first time in his life, James Van Der Beek was not playing a hero on screen. He was becoming a warrior in real life. After the doctor uttered the word cancer, James Van Der Beek's life did not change in the dramatic way people often imagine. There was no public announcement, no bold headlines splashed across the press. Instead, there was silence. For more than a year, James chose to keep his diagnosis private. Not because he was denying reality, but because he wanted to protect his family, to preserve the remaining ordinary days for his 6 children and the wife who had stood beside him through every rise and fall. From the outside, life appeared unchanged. But behind closed doors, everything had become a full-time battle. Appointments layered upon appointments, complex treatment plans, endless calls with doctors and insurance companies, days when his body was exhausted, yet he still had to smile when his children walked into the room. James once said that treatment felt like a full-time job, except one that never truly allows you to rest. He was both a patient learning how to live with a new fear, and a father and husband trying to keep life feeling normal, as if nothing had shifted. There were days he felt strong enough to stand steady, and there were days when simply making it through the morning was already a victory. But the public did not see that. The world still saw the familiar image of the actor who had once shaped their youth, while the man behind the spotlight was quietly racing against time. Eventually, that silence could not last. When James learned that media outlets were preparing to report on his illness, he chose to speak first. Not for attention, but to reclaim the right to tell his story in his own voice. From that moment on, his personal struggle became something larger. Experts began pointing out that colorectal cancer was rising rapidly among people under 50, individuals who did not believe they were in a high-risk group. James's case was no longer just the tragedy of a television star. It became a warning, a reminder that this disease can appear even when you believe you are healthy, even when you exercise, eat well, and assume you have plenty of time ahead. And perhaps that is what made James's fight so meaningful. He was not only fighting for himself, he began sharing his story in the hope that someone out there would get checked sooner and gain a greater chance to live. But as the battle moved into its most difficult stage, a deeper transformation was quietly unfolding within him, something no one could yet see. There are battles that do more than alter the body. They change the way a person looks back at their entire life. By late 2025, James Van Der Beek appeared in an interview that would later become one of the moments many people could not forget. Viewers saw a man thinner, slower in his movements. Yet his eyes carried a different kind of peace. And then he said something that made many pause. "Cancer is the best thing that ever happened to me." It sounded paradoxical, almost impossible to believe. But James did not say it as a denial of pain. He did not romanticize the illness that had drained his strength and time. What he meant was this: the disease forced him to stop long enough to see what he had once rushed past. For years, fame, success, career, all of it had felt like an invisible checklist his younger self was determined to complete. Always moving forward, always proving something, always trying to become something bigger. But when confronted with the true limits of life, everything shifted. James began speaking more about family, not as a curated image on social media, but as the only reason he wanted to wake up each morning. He spoke about his children's hugs, about fleeting yet meaningful moments, about ordinary seconds he might once have hurried past without noticing. The illness also led him to look inward, truly inward, for the first time. He spoke about self-love, about feeling worthy of love not because of success or fame, but simply because he existed. And perhaps that was the deepest transformation of all. The man who once entered Hollywood yearning for recognition no longer seemed consumed by fame. Once, fame had been the goal. Now, it was merely part of the past. He was no longer trying to preserve the image of a teen idol, no longer chasing relevance or the glow of the spotlight the way he had at 20. Instead, James said he simply wanted to be present, truly present, in every moment he still had. Looking back at the entire journey, one sentence seemed to capture it all. Cancer taught me how to live. And perhaps in those final days, as his body grew weaker, the truest version of James Van Der Beek became clearer than ever before. A father, a husband, a man who had stopped running and finally learned how to stay with his own life. Some endings do not arrive with noise, no stage lights, no swelling music, just a quiet morning when the life of James Van Der Beek came to a close in a way that mirrored the man he had become in his final years. On February 11th, 2026, James passed away at home at the age of 48. Not in a hospital surrounded by the hum of machines, but in the place he had chosen to slow down, beside his family, in the space he once said made him feel most at peace. In those final days, he was not alone. Close friends were by his side. They held his hand, prayed with him, even shared laughter, a way of preserving what James had always cherished most, joy, even as life was gently slipping away. Tributes began pouring in almost immediately. Former co-stars, colleagues, and those who had crossed paths with him all echoed the same word: kindness. Not just the star of a beloved teen drama, but a warm, humorous, and sincere human being off-screen. Some called him a warrior with grace. Others said he made them laugh even in the hardest moments, and some simply wrote, "I already miss him." Yet amid the heartfelt tributes, everyday reality remained, as life always does. James's family faced financial strain after the long course of treatment. Medical expenses left a significant gap, and a GoFundMe campaign was created to support Kimberly and their children. In a short time, more than $1 million was raised. That number spoke about more than money. It spoke of love, the love millions held for him. Viewers who had grown up with Dawson Leery, people who had never met James in person, yet felt as though they had just lost someone familiar. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of this final chapter. Because when the lights fade, what remains is not fame, but the imprint a person leaves in the hearts of others. James Van Der Beek is gone, but his story of transformation, of courage, of relearning how to live when death stood close, continues to live in the memory of those who remain. And sometimes that is the most beautiful definition of a legacy. James Van Der Beek will always be remembered as Dawson Leery, the boy who became a symbol for an entire generation. But when we look back at the full arc of his life, it becomes clear that his true legacy does not end with a single role. In his final years as he faced cancer, he chose a path not everyone has the courage to walk. He turned his own painful experience into a message for others. He spoke about illness with honesty, no embellishment, no dramatization, simply a willingness to share, so that people would understand this truth. Cancer can come for anyone, even when you believe you are completely healthy. And from that moment on, James became a voice urging early screening. He repeated one simple but vital message: get checked before it's too late. It may not have been a role on screen, but it was perhaps the most meaningful role of his life. Yet beyond all of that, what James placed above fame and career was something else entirely: family. In his final reflections, he did not speak much about Hollywood. He spoke about his children, about becoming a present father, a man who wanted to devote whatever time remained to the people he loved most. And so, when we look back now, perhaps the greatest legacy of James Van Der Beek does not lie in the glow of television stardom. It lies in the image of a devoted father, a man who learned to slow down, to love more deeply, and to leave behind a message of humanity for those who remain. Because in the end, some actors are remembered for their roles, and some are remembered for the way they faced their lives. The stage lights will eventually fade, the roles will become memories. But some stories continue to live on, not on a screen, but in the emotions of those who once listened. The story of James Van Der Beek did not end with a grand victory, nor with a dramatic farewell. It closed in a profoundly human way, quiet, sincere, and reflective. A shy boy who once believed he did not belong in the spotlight. A young actor who rose too quickly. A man who spent half his life trying to rediscover himself. And finally, a father who learned how to live fully in each remaining moment. Perhaps what makes this story resonate is not fame or tragedy, but transformation. That sometimes, the very things we fear most force us to see what matters most. That time is always limited, no matter how much of it we believe we have. And that the true value of a person may only become clearest when the lights have gone out. If you've stayed with this story until the very end, leave a comment below. In your view, what was the most beautiful part of James Van Der Beek's journey? And if you'd like to continue exploring the stories behind the spotlight, lives that were famous, yet deeply human, be sure to subscribe so we can meet again in the next story. Because sometimes, what lingers the longest is not the light on the stage, but the feeling that echoes after the story is over.